Carlos awoke to the sound of his shelter's ventilation system coughing to life, a daily ritual that marked the beginning of another day on Treasure 11. His muscles ached from yesterday's expedition to Sector 17, but there was a lightness to his movements that hadn't been there in weeks. The cube hidden in his storage compartment represented something rare on this dust-choked planet: opportunity. He performed his morning routine mechanically, recycling yesterday's water vapor into a meager washing supply, choking down a protein bar that tasted like sweetened cardboard, and checking his equipment for the day ahead. As he ran a diagnostic on his scanner, Carlos mentally mapped out his plans. First, the assignment board for today's sector allocation. Then, after his shift, a casual visit to Lena's shop to discuss the valuation of certain theoretical materials one might hypothetically discover. The thought of reducing his contract even by a month brought a small smile to his face. 3 years down, less than 2 to go. If he was smart with his salvage, Carlos stepped out of his shelter into the perpetual hazy twilight of the outpost. The air seemed thicker than usual, heavy with the metallic tang of outpost industry and recycled atmosphere. Around him, other scroungers were emerging from their prefab homes, moving with the shuffling gait of the perpetually exhausted toward the central plaza and the day's assignments. "Fisher!" Carlos turned to see Min Park jogging toward him, out of breath and looking like he hadn't slept. Min's usually well-maintained exosuit was disheveled, with dust clinging to the shoulder joints where it hadn't been properly sealed. "Heard about yesterday," Min said, falling into step beside him. "Ray, the quarantine, everything." Carlos shrugged non-committally. "Nothing to tell. Standard corporate overreaction." "Sure," Min said, his voice low. "Just like it's standard procedure for 3 executive shuttles to land at midnight? Or for specialized containment equipment to be unloaded directly from orbit?" Carlos stopped walking. "What?" "I was on night maintenance rotation at the landing pads. VIP shuttles from SC Treasure 11 primary station. Full hazmat teams. Never seen anything like it." Min's eyes darted around nervously. "Whatever you found out there, it's got the suits worried." Carlos carefully kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced. Corporate executives rarely visited Treasure 11 in person. The planet was considered a necessary unpleasantness, a resource to be exploited from a distance. Actual boots-on-ground visits from upper management happen maybe once a year, with significant advance notice and preparation. "Interesting," Carlos said. "But I've got a sector to salvage. Bills don't pay themselves." Min nodded and continued toward the mess hall while Carlos made his way to the assignment board. The central plaza was already crowded with scroungers checking their day's routes, trading tips about promising sectors and complaining about quotas. The massive digital display dominated the eastern wall of the plaza, scrolling endlessly with names, sector designations, and recovery quotas. Carlos scanned for his name, starting with the 17 sectors where he'd been working recently. Nothing. He checked nearby sectors, thinking perhaps there had been a reassignment due to yesterday's incident. Still nothing. Finally, he ran a search for his ID number. "No assignments found for ID CF73842. Carlos frowned and tried again, same result. "Problem, Fisher." He turned to find Foreman Vega watching him, her cybernetic eyes glinting in the dim light. Unlike yesterday, when she'd been businesslike but fair, her posture now radiated tension. "System glitch," Carlos said. "I'm not showing up on the roster." Vega's artificial eyes whirred slightly as they adjusted focus. "No glitch. You're on administrative stand-down. So are Smith, Kowalski, and Bolivar." "Stand-down? Why?" "We filed all the proper reports about yesterday." "Routine rotation," Vega cut him off, her tone making it clear the subject wasn't open for discussion. "After traumatic incidents, all involved personnel received 24 hours of recovery time." "That's not protocol," Carlos said, keeping his voice even. "Protocol is medical evaluation followed by immediate return to duty unless medically contraindicated. Check the contract section." "I don't need you to quote contract provisions at me, Fisher," Vega snapped. Then, seeming to catch herself, she softened her tone slightly. "Look, it's a paid day off. Take it. Get drunk, sleep, I don't care. Just stay clear of administrative sectors until tomorrow's rotation. Before Carlos could press further, Vega walked away, already calling out assignments to a group of new arrivals. Carlos stood there, processing. In 3 years, he'd never been given a recovery day after incidents. And there had been plenty of incidents, some far worse than yesterday's. Something wasn't adding up. He spotted Marco Smith near the water reclamation station, looking equally disgruntled about his unexpected day off. "You too, huh?" Carlos said, approaching the older scrounger. Marco grunted, a sound that might have been affirmation. "Convenient. All 4 of us who saw that ship benched on the same day. Vega said it's routine rotation." "And I'm the Queen of Mars," Marco snorted. "They found something at that crash site, something big. And they don't want anyone talking about it while they figure out what to do." Carlos thought about the cube hidden in his quarters. If Marco was right, and Salvage Corp was this interested in the crash site, his little salvage operation might be more valuable than he'd initially thought. "What makes you think they found something?" Carlos asked carefully. Marco glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Kowalski's cousin works security dispatch, says they've been moving researchers and specialized equipment into Sector 17 all night, high-level clearance stuff. And get this, the whole sector's gone dark on the monitoring network, like somebody threw a blackout curtain over the whole area." Carlos whistled softly. Corporate blackouts were rare and typically reserved for breakthrough discoveries, the kind that affected stock prices and patent applications. "So what's your plan for the day?" Carlos asked, changing the subject. "Since we're apparently being paid to do nothing." Marco's eyes narrowed slightly. "Staying in my quarters with the door locked seems safest. You?" Carlos shrugged. "Thought I might head to the Bolt, have a drink. Maybe 2. Your funeral," Marco said. "I'll be sure to say nice things at the memorial service after security's done with you." "They've got nothing on me," Carlos replied, the lie coming easily. "They've got nothing on any of us," Marco said, his voice suddenly serious. "That's what worries me. When cores start giving out free time and pay, it means they're buying something. Usually silence." With that cheery thought, Marco trudged off toward the residential sectors, leaving Carlos alone with his thoughts. The unexpected day off complicated matters. He'd planned to keep a low profile, work his sector, then casually visit Lena after his shift. Just another scrounger looking to supplement his meager income with some off-the-books trading. Now, with no sector assigned and the entire day stretching before him, any movement would be more conspicuous. Carlos weighed his options. He could follow Marco's example and hide in his quarters, but that would look suspicious if he was being monitored. Better to act like a scrounger with an unexpected windfall of free time, which meant heading to the Rusty Bolt for a drink. Decision made, Carlos began walking toward the recreation sector. As he moved through the crowded pathways of the outpost, he noticed an unusual number of security personnel patrolling. Not the regular outpost security with their weathered uniforms and bored expressions, but corporate officers in pristine gear, alert and watchful. Something had definitely changed overnight. The question was, what, and how it might affect the small fortune currently hidden in his shelter. Carlos had nearly reached the recreation sector when a priority announcement blared across the outpost's public address system. "Attention all Salvage Corps personnel, Sector 17 is now designated a level black exclusion zone. All previous clearances are revoked. Uninterrupted entry will result in immediate termination of contract and criminal prosecution. Report any usual materials or phenomena to security immediately. Stay safe, stay vigilant, stay productive. Level black." Carlos had never heard that designation before. The highest he'd encountered was level red, which was bad enough. Whatever they'd found in that alien craft, it had the corporate hierarchy spooked, and that made Carlos's hidden cube all the more intriguing and dangerous. As he approached the Rusty Bolt, Carlos made a decision. He'd have 1 drink, enough to establish his presence and demonstrate he had nothing to hide, then casually make his way to Lena's. The sooner he converted his find into credits, the safer he'd be. With any luck, by tomorrow he'd be back on rotation, a month closer to freedom, and the strange events of Sector 17 would be nothing but a fading memory. But as Carlos would soon discover, luck was in short supply on Treasure 11. And memories, like the ancient alien artifacts buried beneath its surface, had a way of refusing to stay buried. Carlos rounded the final corner toward the rusty bolt, already anticipating the burn of synthetic whiskey and the comforting background noise of fellow scroungers drowning their sorrows. The bolt wasn't much, a repurposed storage facility with mismatched furniture and drinks that tasted like industrial solvent, but it was the closest thing to a community center the outpost had. He stopped short. The pathway ahead was blocked by a security cordon. Not the standard yellow barriers used for minor incidents, but glossy black barricades bearing the Salvage Corps emblem and the words "Biohazard Containment" in glowing red letters. Beyond the barricades, a cluster of security personnel in sealed environmental suits moved with practiced efficiency around what remained of the rusty bolt. And there wasn't much remaining. The front half of the structure appeared normal, if a bit scorched, but the back section simply ended. Not collapsed or destroyed, but terminated in a perfectly smooth curve, as if someone had taken an enormous scoop out of the building. Through the gap, Carlos could see the prefab structures behind the bar, now exposed like a dollhouse with one wall removed. "What the hell?" he muttered, approaching the cordon. A small crowd had gathered at the security perimeter, scroungers and outpost workers watching the containment operation with the morbid fascination of people witnessing a disaster that hadn't quite caught them in its path. "Fisher!" a voice called out. Carlos turned to see Javier, a maintenance tech who moonlighted as the bolt's unofficial bouncer, waving him over. Javier's left arm was bandaged, and a medic was checking his vitals as he sat on a portable stretcher. "What happened?" Carlos asked, ducking under the crowd control tape to reach his friend. Javier's usually ruddy face was pale beneath his shock blanket. "Some idiot brought in salvage last night. After you all got back from Sector 17, Crosting was trying to show it off at the bar. Bringing salvage into the bolt? That's against Lena's rules," Carlos said, confused. Lena, who owned the establishment, had strict policies about keeping potentially dangerous alien tech out of her bar, a rule enforced enthusiastically by Javier's massive frame. "Yeah, well, he hit it good. Little thing, about the size of a credit chip. Had these weird markings that glowed when he touched it." Javier glanced toward the ruined structure. "I was at the door when it went off, knocked me clear across the yard. Lucky, I guess." A chill ran down Carlos's spine as he thought of the cube in his shelter. The guy who brought it in? What happened to him? Javier shook his head. "Vaporized, along with anyone within 5 meters. The rest..." He gestured vaguely at the building's sheared-off section. "They're saying it wasn't an explosion, more like the space just stopped being there." "Phase displacement," said a clipped voice behind them. Carlos turned to find a Salvage Corp security officer standing there, his visor raised to reveal a face too young and unmarked for the authority in his voice. The officer's uniform bore the insignia of the corporate science division rather than standard security. "The phenomenon is called phase displacement," the officer continued. "The object created a localized event that shifted a portion of our reality into an adjacent dimensional space." "Is that permanent?" Carlos asked, thinking of the people who'd been inside. The officer stared at him with clinical detachment. "For all practical purposes, yes. Those caught in the event are lost. The missing section of the structure now exists in what we might simplistically call elsewhere, though that's not technically accurate." "How do you know all this?" Javier asked. "Similar events have been documented," the officer said vaguely. Then, seeming to realize he'd said too much, he stiffened. "This area is under containment. All civilians need to remain behind the perimeter." With that, he turned and walked back toward the ruined building. "Similar events," Carlos repeated quietly. "Sounds like they've seen this before." Javier grunted. Whatever. I just lost my job and my drinking spot in one go. Carlos scanned the crowd, suddenly remembering his purpose. Is Lena around? Was she? Javier's expression gave him the answer before his words did. She was behind the bar, dead center of the event. Carlos felt his stomach drop. Lena? Gone. His fens, his friend of sorts, and the only person he'd trusted to handle his find discreetly, wiped from existence by the same kind of technology he now had hidden in his shelter. As if on cue, a team of medics emerged from behind the building, carrying a stretcher bearing a sheet-covered form. Unlike the others they'd brought out, this one wasn't being rushed toward the medical facility, but instead moved carefully toward a containment vehicle. Something about their deliberate movements caught Carlos's attention. He edged closer, trying to get a better view. The sheet slipped slightly as they navigated past debris, revealing what lay beneath. Carlos fought to keep his expression neutral, but his blood ran cold. The body on the stretcher was charred beyond recognition, but clutched in what remained of its hand was a small metallic cube, identical to the one hidden in Carlos's shelter. "Make way!" a security officer barked, noticing Carlos's attention. "Contaminated remains, stand clear." Carlos stepped back, mind racing. The coincidence was too perfect. Another cube, appearing the same night he'd smuggled one back from Sector 17. A cube that had phased half the bar out of existence. He watched as they loaded the stretcher into the containment vehicle. Through the open doors, he glimpsed more security officers and what appeared to be a research team in specialized equipment, all focused on the body, or more likely, on what it held. "Fisher," Javier called out, now being helped to his feet by the medic. "You okay, man? You look like you saw a ghost." "Just processing," Carlos managed. "How many people were in there?" 32 confirmed missing, said the medic, checking something on her data pad. "Could have been worse. Night crowds usually bigger. 32 people gone because of a little cube with swirling patterns. A cube just like the one sitting in Carlos's shelter." "I should go," Carlos said abruptly. "They're probably going to quarantine this whole sector." Javier nodded. "Yeah, listen, there's a card game at Kowalski's tonight if you'd need somewhere to be. Quiet, you know. After all this?" "Thanks, but I think I'm going to find somewhere to drink," Carlos replied. "I need to process all this." As he turned to leave, he caught snippets of conversation from the crowd. "Third incident this month? Corporate cover-up? Always connected to new salvage." Carlos moved through the gathering, trying to appear casual while his mind worked furiously. If his cube was dangerous, potentially catastrophically dangerous, he needed to unload it immediately. But with Lena gone, his usual channels were closed. As he neared the edge of the crowd, a man in a stained exosuit bumped into him, clearly drunk despite the early hour. "Watch it," Carlos muttered. Instead of moving on, the man gripped Carlos's arm with surprising strength. His breath reeked of cheap synthetic alcohol, but his eyes were clear and focused. "You're Fisher," the man said, not a question. "The one from Sector 17 yesterday." Carlos tensed, ready to defend himself. "What about it?" The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The empty flask. East Sector. Ask for Trask." He pressed something into Carlos's palm. "He'll know what to do with what you found." Before Carlos could respond, the man melted into the crowd with surprising agility for someone ostensibly drunk. Carlos glanced down at what he'd been given. A small token made of compressed metal shavings, stamped with an unfamiliar symbol, a circle containing what looked like a stylized flask or bottle. East Sector, the rough part of the outpost, where independent operators and those on the wrong side of corporate policy congregated. Carlos had avoided it during his 3 years on Treasure 11, having heard enough stories about contract jumpers who disappeared after venturing into that lawless maze of makeshift shelters and black market operations. But now, with Lena gone and his cube potentially a ticking time bomb, his options were limited. He could turn the cube in to security and face charges for concealing salvage, a breach of contract that would likely add years to his term. He could try to dispose of it. But if it was as volatile as the one from the Bolt, mishandling could be fatal. Or he could find this Trask and hope the stranger's confidence wasn't misplaced. Carlos pocketed the token and began walking away from the containment zone, his steps measured and unhurried despite the urgency building within him. Security cameras covered most public areas of the outpost, and appearing suspicious now would be dangerous. As he walked, the outpost's public address system crackled to life again. "Attention all Salvage Corps personnel, by order of Central Administration. All private quarters will undergo standard safety inspection beginning at 1,300 hours. Please ensure all personal areas are accessible. These inspections are routine and mandatory. Stay safe, stay vigilant, stay productive." Carlos checked his chronometer. 1,300 hours was less than 2 hours away. He'd never experienced a routine inspection of private quarters in 3 years on Treasure 11.11. They were looking for something, and given the timing, that something was almost certainly cubes like the one he'd smuggled back, and the one that had just destroyed the rusty bolt. His decision made for him, Carlos changed direction and began moving toward the east sector. If he hurried, he might have time to retrieve the cube from his shelter before the inspections began. If not, well, he'd have to hope that his hiding place was good enough to fool corporate scanners. Either way, it seemed the empty flask was his destination, and possibly his only hope of surviving the day. Carlos moved quickly through the outpost's main sectors, his path deliberately meandering to throw off any watchers. The announcement of quarters inspections had sent a ripple of anxiety through the Scrounger community. Even those with nothing to hide had learned to fear corporate intrusion. He needed to retrieve his cube before security reached his shelter. Based on past inspections, they would start from the administrative center and work outward in concentric rings. His quarters were in the third ring, which bought him perhaps an hour. Carlos took a circuitous route back to his shelter, pausing at public terminals to check non-existent messages, nodding to fellow Scroungers with a carefully cultivated air of normalcy. Only when he was certain he wasn't being followed did he approach his quarters. The prefab shelter looked untouched, its door securely sealed. Carlos disabled his crude but effective security measures. A strand of hair trapped in the door seal, a small pebble balanced on the entry pad that would fall if disturbed. Both were in place. No one had entered since his departure. Inside, he moved quickly. The cube remained secure in its hidden compartment, still wrapped in the shielding material. Carlos studied it with new wariness, recalling the destruction at the rusty bolt. What had triggered that cube to phase half the bar out of existence? Had its owner mishandled it somehow? Or was it fundamentally different from the one he held? Questions without answers and no time to ponder them. Carlos wrapped the cube in additional layers of shielding material, then slipped it into a specially modified pouch in his exosuit, designed to block scanner signals and originally used for smuggling high-value minerals past company checkpoints. He grabbed a few essentials: extra water tablets, med patches, a small concealable blade, and a handful of trade tokens. Then erased his datapad's recent entries. If security dug through his personal logs, they'd find nothing connecting him to Sector 17 beyond his official report. Carlos exited his shelter, reactivating his simple security measures. They wouldn't stop a corporate search, but would at least tell him if they'd been there. Then he set off toward the eastern sector, moving with deliberate casualness. The transition between outpost zones was gradual but unmistakable. The relatively maintained pathways of the main residential sectors gave way to increasingly haphazard construction. Standard prefab units built to corporate specifications were replaced by makeshift structures, cobbled together from salvaged materials. The Salvage Corp logo, omnipresent in the main outpost, appeared less frequently, often defaced or modified with crude additions. As Carlos ventured deeper into the eastern sector, the atmosphere grew noticeably tenser. Eyes tracked his movement from shadowed doorways. The corporate Scrounger uniform he wore marked him as an outsider here, where many residents were contract jumpers or independents who lived beyond corporate oversight. Often violently enforced, a child with unnaturally pale skin, a mutation from radiation exposure common among those without corporate-issued protection, ran past him, giving Carlos a wide berth. The child's eyes had the milky cast of light sensitivity, another telltale sign of adaptation to Treasure 11's harsh environment across generations. "You're off your turf, Corpman," called a voice from a nearby alley. Carlos turned to see a woman leaning against a wall of salvaged hull plating. Her exosuit was a patchwork of different materials, its original corporate markings burned away. A makeshift weapon, something between a shock rod and a mining tool, hung casually from her belt. "Just looking for a drink," Carlos replied evenly. "The bolt had an accident." The woman snorted. "Accident, right." She pushed off from the wall and approached him, measuring him with a calculating gaze. "You're either brave or stupid to come this far east in that uniform." Carlos remained still, hands visible and non-threatening. "I heard there's a place called the Empty Flask." "Heard wrong," she said flatly. "No such place." Carlos hesitated, then slowly withdrew the token the stranger had pressed into his palm. He held it up without comment. The woman's demeanor changed instantly. She glanced at the token, then at Carlos with new interest. "Who gave you that?" "Someone who said I should ask for Trask." She studied him for a long moment, then jerked her head toward a narrow passage between buildings. "This way. And put that away before someone decides to take it from you, along with the fingers holding it." Carlos pocketed the token and followed her into the maze of the eastern sector. They navigated through increasingly narrow passages, winding between structures that defied architectural logic, some built vertically from stacked shipping containers, others extending horizontally in precarious overhangs. The woman moved with the confidence of someone traversing familiar territory, occasionally gesturing for Carlos to duck or step carefully over jury-rigged power cables or waste pipes. Several times they passed groups of people who eyed Carlos with open hostility, only backing down when his guide made subtle hand gestures. After 15 minutes of increasingly disorienting turns, they stopped before what appeared to be a solid wall of scrap metal. The woman pressed her hand against a seemingly random panel, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage. "End of the line," she said, "through there. And word of advice: don't lie to Trask. He's got a way of knowing." Before Carlos could thank her, she melted back into the labyrinth, leaving him facing the hidden entrance. Taking a deep breath, he ducked through the opening. The passage opened into a surprisingly large space, what appeared to be the interior of a crashed alien vessel, its hull partially buried in the outpost's foundation. The curved walls were covered in the same iridescent material Carlos had seen on numerous salvage operations, but never in such a complete, preserved specimen. The makeshift bar that gave the place its name occupied the center of the space, a crescent-shaped counter fashioned from what looked like the navigation console of the ancient ship. Mismatched chairs and tables, salvaged from a dozen different sources, were arranged throughout the space, most occupied by patrons who bore the unmistakable look of those living outside corporate oversight. The air was thick with the smell of synthetic alcohol, unfamiliar smoke, and the metallic tang that permeated everything on Treasure11.com. Conversations ebbed briefly as Carlos entered, a dozen pairs of eyes assessing the corporate uniform before dismissing him as non-threatening. Carlos approached the bar, where a tall, thin man with extensive facial scarring was mixing drinks in containers that had clearly begun life as laboratory equipment. "What's your poison, Corpman?" the bartender asked, not looking up from his work. "Looking for Trask," Carlos said quietly. The bartender paused, then pointed toward a darkened alcove at the far end of the bar. "Your funeral?" Carlos nodded thanks and made his way toward the alcove, conscious of the weight of the cube against his side. The conversations around him were unlike those in the Rusty Bolt. These people spoke more freely, without the careful self-censoring that characterized corporate scrounger interactions. "Third shipment intercepted at the Heap southern quadrant. Just disappeared, entire crew. Orbital says it was a nav error, but calling it Propository 11 in the old records, bastards knew what was here all along." The term caught Carlos's attention. He'd never heard anyone refer to Treasure 11 as the Heaps or Repository 11 before today. Something about the latter term nagged at him, but he had no time to dwell on it as he reached the alcove. A heavy curtain of salvaged material, what looked like decontamination sheeting, separated the alcove from the main room. Carlos paused, uncertain of protocol. "Enter or leave, but don't stand there like a security drone," came a raspy voice from behind the curtain. Carlos pushed the curtain aside and stepped into a small, dimly lit space. Sitting at a table covered with datapads, samples of alien tech, and what appeared to be hand-drawn maps, was an older man with a neatly trimmed white beard. His exosuit bore the faded insignia of a dozen different corporations, all deliberately defaced but still recognizable to someone who knew what to look for. Most surprising was the Salvage Corp Science Division patch on his shoulder, the highest clearance level, usually reserved for off-world researchers who never set foot on Treasure 11 itself. "Scrounger Fisher," the man said, gesturing to an empty chair. "I've been expecting you since the incident at Sector 17. Carlos remained standing, wariness overtaking curiosity. "You have me at a disadvantage." The man smiled thinly. "I have everyone at a disadvantage. It's how I've survived 30 years on this hellhole. I'm Trask, former chief research analyst for Salvage Corp, current information broker for those with the sense to listen." He tapped a data pad. "Sit. You have approximately 40 minutes before security reaches your shelter and discovers you fled with company property." "How could you possibly know that?" Carlos asked, reluctantly taking the offered seat. "Because I still have access to security deployment schedules," Trask replied casually. "And because I know exactly what you found in Sector 17, because I've been tracking similar finds for the past decade." Carlos said nothing, his hand unconsciously moving to the hidden pouch containing the cube. Trask's eyes followed the movement. "Yes, I know about that too. One of those nearly wiped out half my research team 7 years ago when we misunderstood what we were dealing with." He leaned forward. "The question is, do you know what you're carrying, or did you just smuggle it out because anything valuable enough to hide from the company is worth the risk?" "It's a data storage device," Carlos ventured, repeating what his scanner had suggested. "Valuable for the Radioron and Xenthium content if nothing else." Trask laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "Is that what your Scrounger-grade scanner told you? No wonder your kind dies so frequently." He tapped another datapad, turning it to face Carlos. "This is what you're carrying." The screen displayed a detailed schematic of a cube identical to the one Carlos had found, but with annotations highlighting complex internal structures invisible to standard scanners. "Repository marker," Trask said. "That's the closest translation from the original language. Part key, part map, part warning system. The alien civilization that created Treasure 11, or as they called it, Repository 11, left these as navigation tools for those who would eventually return to claim their archived knowledge." "Archived knowledge?" Carlos repeated, trying to process this information. "Treasure 11 is just a junkyard, is it?" Trask challenged. "Look around you, Scrounger. Have you ever questioned why technology from a dozen different alien civilizations, spanning what must be thousands of years of development, all ended up on one unremarkable planet in the outer rim? Why some of it still functions after centuries of exposure, why the deeper you dig, the more organized the arrangement of artifacts becomes?" Carlos had noticed patterns in the salvage distribution. Most Scroungers had, but had attributed it to natural settling processes or the effects of the planet's unusual magnetic fields. "The Heaps," Carlos said slowly, recalling the term he'd overheard. "That's what the Independents call this place. Not Treasure 11, because they're closer to the truth than the corporate drones," Trask confirmed. "This planet isn't a random trash heap. It's a deliberately constructed archive, a repository of technology and knowledge from a civilization advanced enough to preserve it for millions of years." Carlos's skepticism must have shown on his face, because Trask sighed and pulled up another file on his datapad. "Salvage Corp has known this for at least 50 years, he said, showing Carlos what appeared to be an internal memo with the highest security classification. They discovered the first repository marker during the initial survey mission. It activated when handled improperly, erasing half the survey team from existence, much like what happened at the Rusty Bolt today. If that's true, why keep sending scroungers to salvage random tech? Carlos asked. Why not mount a proper archaeological expedition? Trask's expression hardened. Because archaeology requires sharing knowledge with the scientific community. It requires documentation, preservation, context. Salvage Corp doesn't want to study this place. They want to strip it for parts, reverse engineer what they can, and maintain exclusive patents on the technology they derive. He gestured around at the bar. The people here, the independents, the contract jumpers, the ones who've seen behind the corporate veil. We've been piecing together the truth for years. The repository markers are keys to specific archive sectors. They contain navigational data, access protocols, and warning systems for the defensive mechanisms that protect the most valuable archives. Carlos thought of the strange ship that had taken Ray, the way it had responded to human presence. Like the craft in Sector 17? Exactly, Trask nodded. Guardian vessels, programmed to activate when unauthorized access is attempted. Your teammate wasn't killed, Fisher. She was scanned, categorized, and contained for future processing. Standard protocol for the repository security system when dealing with unknown biological entities. The implications were staggering. If Trask was telling the truth, then everything Carlos thought he knew about Treasure 11, about his purpose here, was a corporate fabrication. Why tell me this? Carlos asked finally. Why not just take the cube from me? You clearly have people who could have ambushed me on the way here. Trask leaned back, studying Carlos with unexpected intensity. Because we need people like you, scroungers with corporate access, with the skills to recognize valuable finds, but with enough independence to question the official narrative. He gestured to the datapad showing the internal memo. I left Salvage Corps when I discovered they were deliberately sacrificing scrounger teams to test the repository's defensive systems, sending people like you to their deaths to map the dangers, without ever telling you what you were really looking for. Carlos remembered all the accidents he'd witnessed over the years, the sectors suddenly quarantined after scrounger teams vanished, the inconsistencies in official reports. What you're suggesting is, he began. Treason against Salvage Corp, Trask finished for him. Absolutely. But I'm also suggesting a chance to understand what's really happening on this planet, and perhaps more importantly to you, a chance to reduce your contract terms significantly. He tapped the pouch where Carlos's cube was hidden. That marker alone contains access protocols worth a fortune to the right buyers, enough to pay off your contract 3 times over. Before Carlos could respond, the curtain behind him was suddenly pulled aside. The woman who had guided him to the empty flask stood there, her expression grim. Security sweep, she said tersely. Corporate teams entering the east sector, full tactical gear. Trask was on his feet immediately. How many? 3 squads, moving in standard search pattern. They're scanning for power signatures and unauthorized tech. She glanced at Carlos. And they're showing his image to people they stop? Carlos felt cold dread settle in his stomach. They've been to my shelter. Certainly, Trask confirmed, already gathering datapads and samples. The question now, Fisher, is what you intend to do. You can try to run, though with a repository marker on you, their scanners will find you eventually. You can surrender and face contract extension, probably in a mining outpost where conditions make Treasure 11 look like a paradise. Or, Carlos prompted. Or you can join us, Trask said simply. Help us understand what's really happening on Repository 11. Help us uncover the truth that Salvage Corp and the other corporations have been hiding. In exchange, we offer protection, knowledge, and your eventual freedom from corporate control. The woman by the curtain shifted impatiently. Decide quickly, Corpman. Security will reach this sector in 15 minutes. Carlos looked between them, weighing his options. The cube in his pouch suddenly felt heavier, its significance greater than he could have imagined when he slipped it into his pocket at the crash site. The repository, the guardian vessels, the systematic corporate deception. It explained so much about the inconsistencies he'd noticed during his years on Treasure 11, and if Trask was right about Ray not being dead but contained, processed, he'd said, there might be a chance to find out what happened to her. I need to know more, Carlos said finally, about the repository, about what happened to Ray, about how these markers work, but for now, he reached into his pouch and extracted the cube, still wrapped in its shielding material, and placed it on the table. I'm in, Trask smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his scarred face. Welcome to the truth, Scrounger Fisher. Now let's get you somewhere secure before security turns this sector upside down. As they prepared to leave through what Trask called the back channels, Carlos glanced around the empty flask one more time. The patrons continued their conversations, seemingly unconcerned about the approaching security sweep, protected by the anonymity and solidarity of those who existed on the margins. For the first time since arriving on Treasure 11, Carlos felt something unexpected, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival and contract completion. Whatever secrets lay buried in the planet they called the Heaps, he was now part of uncovering them. And somewhere out there, perhaps Ray was still alive, caught in the ancient protocols of a civilization advanced enough to blur the lines between existence and non-existence. Finding her would be impossible alone, but with Trask's knowledge and resources, perhaps there was a chance. As they slipped through a hidden passage in the back of the ancient ship-turned bar, Carlos realized he had crossed a line. There would be no returning to his life as a salvage corps scrounger. For better or worse, he had just become something else entirely. He just hoped he would live long enough to discover what that meant. "Keep up, Corpman," hissed the woman, who had finally introduced herself as Dex, as she led Carlos and Trask through a bewildering network of maintenance tunnels beneath the eastern sector. Carlos struggled to maintain his bearings as they descended deeper, moving through passages that showed clear signs of alien architecture. Curved walls with the same iridescent material he'd seen in the empty flask. Strange geometric patterns that seemed to emit a faint luminescence when touched. "Where exactly are we going?" Carlos asked, ducking beneath a low-hanging pipe. "Somewhere security won't find you," Trask replied without slowing. The corporations mapped most of the upper tunnel systems decades ago, but they never fully explored the deeper networks, too dangerous for their tastes. But not for yours. Carlos noted the ease with which the older man navigated the increasingly alien surroundings. Trask's laugh echoed off the curved walls. "The propository doesn't harm those who respect its systems. The corporations treat this planet like a mine to be stripped. We treat it like the archive it is." After nearly 30 minutes of descent, they arrived at a massive circular door embedded in the tunnel wall. Unlike the makeshift construction of the outpost above, this structure was clearly original, seamless metal with the same intricate patterns Carlos had seen on his cube. Dex approached the door and placed her palm against a specific section of the pattern. Nothing happened. "New guest," she said, jerking her head toward Carlos. "Need authorization." Trask gestured for Carlos to approach. "Place your hand where hers was. The repository's systems respond to biological signatures." Carlos hesitated. "Is this safe? Safer than staying up there with a corporation hunting you for treason?" Trask replied dryly. "Point taken." Carlos stepped forward and pressed his palm against the indicated section of the door. Immediately, the patterns beneath his hand illuminated, lines of light spreading outward in concentric circles. A warm sensation passed through his palm, not unpleasant but distinctly alien, as if something was reading him at a cellular level. The door responded with a series of musical tones, and then, to Carlos's amazement, it simply dissolved, the seemingly solid metal becoming transparent and then vanishing entirely. "Welcome to the Nexus," Trask said, gesturing Carlos through the opening. Beyond the door lay a vast chamber that defied Carlos's understanding of Treasure 11's construction. The ceiling soared at least 30 meters above them, supported by elegant columns that branched like crystalline trees. The floor was a mosaic of what appeared to be star charts, glowing faintly beneath their feet. Most impressive were the walls, covered in display panels showing data in alien script that shifted and changed as if responding to their presence. But what truly shocked Carlos was the people, At least 24 individuals moved purposefully through the chamber, working at stations fashioned from alien technology interfaced with human equipment. Some wore the patchwork gear of Eastern Sector independents, others the modified uniforms of corporate deserters, and a few wore environmental suits unlike any Carlos had seen, more advanced, more elegant in design. "What is this place?" Carlos asked, his voice hushed with awe. "This is the true heart of Repository 11, Trask replied, leading him deeper into the chamber of several nexus points scattered across the planet, access hubs to the archive system that the original builders created. "We discovered this one 7 years ago when we followed the navigational data from a repository marker similar to yours. How have the corporations not found this?" Carlos couldn't imagine Salvage Corp missing something of this magnitude during their decades of exploitation. "Oh, they've found others," Trask said grimly. "They just don't understand how to use them properly. Corporate science is focused on immediate gains, how to weaponize technology, how to patent it, how to profit from it. They treat the nexus points as salvage operations, tearing out components and destroying the underlying systems in the process." He gestured around at the functioning chamber. "We take a different approach. We study, we learn, we try to understand what the repository was designed to do." They approached a central platform where several people were gathered around a holographic display showing what appeared to be a three-dimensional map of Treasure 11. Sections of the planet were highlighted in different colors, with pulsing points marking specific locations. "Sophia," Trask called out, "we have a new friend with valuable information." A tall woman with close-cropped silver hair turned from the display. She wore a modified scientific exosuit bearing patches from 6 research institutions, all deliberately obscured. Her piercing blue eyes assessed Carlos with clinical precision. "The scrounger from Sector 17, she stated. "You found a marker." Carlos glanced at Trask. "News travels fast. Information is our true currency here," Sophia replied. She gestured to the holographic display. "You've arrived at an interesting time, Scrounger Fisher. Your discovery in Sector 17 corresponds with an activation pattern we've been tracking." Carlos studied the display. Now that he looked closer, he could see that one of the pulsing points matched the location of the crash site, where they'd found the alien vessel. "The ship that took Ray," he said. "What was it really?" Sophia manipulated the display, zooming in on Sector 17. The hologram shifted to show a detailed rendering of the ship they'd discovered. "Guardian vessel," she replied. "Part of the repository security network. They activate when unauthorized access is attempted, or when the repository itself initiates a cataloging cycle." "What happens to the people they take?" Carlos asked, remembering Ray's sudden disappearance. Sophia and Trask exchanged glances. "That's complicated," Trask began. "Show me," Carlos insisted. Sophia sighed and adjusted the display again. The image shifted to show what appeared to be cross-sectional diagrams of the Guardian vessel, with annotations in both alien script and translated human language. "The vessels don't take people in the way you understand it," she explained. "They process them." The repository was designed by a civilization with a fundamentally different understanding of existence than humans. To them, information and matter were interchangeable. The Guardian vessels scan, digitize, and catalog biological entities they encounter, creating what we might call a quantum informational copy. "You're saying Ray was digitized?" Carlos struggled to comprehend. "Like data?" "More like translated from one state of existence to another," Trask clarified. "Her physical form was converted to information and stored within the repository's systems. From the perspective of the original builders, this wouldn't be seen as destruction, but as preservation." Carlos felt a cold realization dawning. The incident at the Rusty Bolt. The phase displacement. That was the same technology, wasn't it? Sophia nodded grimly. "An uncontrolled activation of a repository marker. The markers are designed to interface with the repository systems, but they require proper protocols. When handled improperly, they attempt to establish a connection anyway, creating unstable transitions between physical space and the information architecture of the repository. Is there any way to bring them back? Carlos asked, the question that really mattered to him. Ray and the others who were taken? A silence fell over the group. Trask and Sophia exchanged another look, this one heavier with meaning. Theoretically, Sophia said finally, the information pattern of anyone processed by repository technology still exists within the system. With the right interface and protocols, that pattern could potentially be reconstituted. But you haven't done it, Carlos observed. We've tried, Trask admitted. 3 times. The first 2 attempts resulted in incomplete reconstructions. The third was more successful, but the subject exhibited significant cognitive alterations. They came back wrong, Dex interjected bluntly from behind them, where she'd been silently observing. Different memories, different personality, like someone had shuffled their components and reassembled them in the wrong order. Carlos absorbed this, feeling a mixture of horror and fascination. But you're still trying? Of course, Sophia said. Each attempt teaches us more about the system, and each repository marker we recover contains new data on the archive protocols. She gestured to a secured container near the holographic display. Which brings us to your contribution. Trask approached the container and carefully placed Carlos's cube inside. Immediately, the container illuminated and streams of data appeared on a nearby terminal. Your marker is different from others we've analyzed, Sophia observed, studying the display. The access protocols are more comprehensive, and it contains location data for a section of the repository we haven't yet mapped. What exactly is the repository? Carlos asked, watching as they worked. I understand it's an archive, but of what? Why create something so elaborate only to abandon it? Trask smiled, seeming pleased by the question. That's the billion-credit question, isn't it? Based on what we've deciphered, the civilization that created Repository 11 was facing some kind of extinction-level threat. They constructed repositories like this across multiple star systems, preserving their knowledge, technology, and possibly even themselves in information form. The prevailing theory, Sophia added, is that they planned to return once the threat had passed. The repository was designed to maintain itself for millions of years if necessary. And the corporations know this? Carlos asked. Some of it, Trask confirmed. But their focus is narrower. Salvage Corp and the others treat Repository 11 as a technology mine, not as the vast cultural and scientific archive it truly is. They're like looters in an ancient library, tearing pages from books to sell individually without caring about the knowledge contained in the complete text. As Carlos watched them work, the enormity of what he'd stumbled into began to sink in. Everything he thought he knew about Treasure 11, about his purpose here as a scrounger, had been built on corporate lies and deliberate misdirection. So what now? He asked. Security is looking for me. My contract is effectively void. I can't go back to being a scrounger. Now, Trask said, looking up from the terminal, you become something else. Someone who knows the truth about Repository 11 and can help us access its secrets without destroying them in the process. We need people with your skills, Sophia explained. You've been trained to identify valuable technology, to extract it safely from hazardous environments. Those same skills are invaluable to our work, but applied with understanding rather than corporate greed. And there's more, Trask added, his expression turning serious. Your marker contains coordinates for a previously unknown nexus point in Sector 19. Based on the preliminary analysis, it may be a primary access hub, one of the main control centers for the entire repository system. If we can access it, Sophia continued, we might finally understand the full scope of what Repository 11 was designed to do, and potentially gain the knowledge necessary to properly extract those who have been processed by the system. Including Ray, Carlos said, understanding their implication. Including Ray, Trask confirmed. But accessing this nexus won't be simple. Sector 19 is under heavy corporate surveillance, and the marker indicates multiple Guardian vessels protecting the approach. We'll need to create a specialized team, Sophia explained. People who understand both the corporate security systems and the repository protocols. Your experience in Sector 17, surviving an encounter with a Guardian vessel, makes you uniquely qualified. Carlos looked around the Nexus chamber, at the people working to understand an alien archive beyond human comprehension, at the holographic display showing the true nature of the planet he'd thought was just a cosmic junkyard. He thought of Ray existing somehow as information within the vast repository network, and all the others who had been processed over the years of corporate exploitation. I want to help, he said finally, but I also want to understand what I'm getting into. No more half-truths or convenient omissions. Trask nodded solemnly. Fair enough. We'll show you everything we know about the repository, about the corporation's activities, about our own work. Then you can decide if our cause is worth your commitment. And in the meantime, Sophia added, we need to ensure your safety. Salvage Corp won't stop looking for you, not just because of the marker you took, but because of what you witnessed in Sector 17.17. They can't afford to have that information spreading among the Scrounger population. We have secure quarters in the lower levels, Trask said. You'll need to stay there while we make arrangements to officially disappear you from the corporate systems. Once you're listed as missing or dead, we can begin creating a new identity for you within the independent networks. Carlos considered this. Becoming officially dead meant abandoning any hope of completing his contract and returning to Earth. It meant committing fully to a life in the shadows of Repository 11, fighting against the corporations that controlled the planet's resources. But it also meant purpose, something beyond the daily grind of meeting quotas and avoiding hazards. It meant uncovering the truth about an ancient civilization and its remarkable technologies. And it meant a chance, however slim, to bring back Ray and others like her. All right, he said, show me everything. But first, I want to know more about these Guardian vessels and how they work. If we're going to attempt a rescue, I need to understand exactly what happened to Ray. Sophia nodded approval. A practical approach. I think you'll fit in well here, Fisher. She turned to one of her colleagues. Jensen, access the Guardian vessel archives. Full permissions for our new colleague. As they moved deeper into the Nexus, Carlos felt a strange sense of alignment, as if the random events that had led him to this moment suddenly revealed themselves as part of a pattern. From finding the cube in Sector 17 to meeting Trask at the empty flask, each step had brought him closer to a truth larger than he could have imagined. Repository 11, not a heap of discarded alien technology, but a deliberate archive of an ancient civilization's knowledge. Not a treasure to be plundered, but a legacy to be understood. And somewhere within its vast information architecture, Ray and countless others existed, waiting to be properly recovered. It was a challenge beyond anything Carlos had faced as a Scrounger, but for the first time since arriving on this dust-choked planet, he felt something like hope. As they reached a terminal displaying detailed schematics of the Guardian vessels, a sudden alarm echoed through the Nexus chamber. The holographic display in the center flickered and shifted to show a section of the outpost above them. Security breach in Sector 14, someone called out. Corporate teams moving in grid pattern, using deep scan technology. They're getting closer to this entrance, Trask observed, his expression grim. We may need to relocate sooner than planned. Sophia turned to Carlos. It seems your former employers are quite determined to find you, Fisher. Perhaps what you witnessed in Sector 17 was even more significant than we realized. Carlos watched the security teams on the display, methodically searching the eastern sector with equipment far more advanced than standard corporate gear. Whatever they were looking for, they were sparing no expense to find it. Or maybe, he said slowly, an idea forming, they're not just looking for me. Maybe they're looking for what my marker points to, the Nexus in Sector 19. Trask's eyes widened slightly. If they've somehow decoded similar information from their own sources, then we're in a race, Sophia finished, and we can't afford to lose. The alarm continued to sound, a persistent reminder of the dangers above. But deeper in the Nexus, protected by ancient technologies beyond corporate understanding, Carlos Fisher began to learn the truth about Repository 11 and plan his return to Sector 17, where this journey had begun. The Guardian vessel that had taken Ray was still there, under corporate quarantine, and if what Trask and Sophia believed was true, it held not only the key to Ray's recovery, but possibly to understanding the entire repository system. Carlos studied the vessel schematics, committing every detail to memory. He wasn't just a scrounger anymore, picking through alien trash for corporate profits. He was becoming something new, a seeker of truth in a repository of ancient knowledge, a rescuer of those lost to technologies beyond human comprehension. And somewhere in the vast information architecture of Repository 11, Ray was waiting. Not dead, not gone, just translated into another form of existence. Findable, recoverable, if only they could unlock the secrets that lay buried beneath the trash. As the security alert escalated and plans for relocation began, Carlos felt a strange certainty settle over him. He had found his true purpose on this dust-choked planet, not in fulfilling a corporate contract, but in uncovering the truth beneath the trash. The real treasures of Treasure 11 were only just beginning to reveal themselves. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.